Racist flight attendant confronts black woman when her CEO mom steps in. What happens is shocking. Tensions soar when a commercial flight takes an unexpected turn. A routine journey transforms into a shocking confrontation as racial prejudices surface midair. A flight attendant targets a black woman, sparking a heated exchange that leaves passengers in disbelief. Tell us whether you find great excitement in this narrative. Press 1 if the video delighted you. Press 0 otherwise not. Your comments really motivate me to compile more inspiring and significant narratives.
The Boston Logan International Airport was alive with the steady rhythm of early morning activity. The low hum of conversations blended with the whir of suitcases rolling across polished floors. Passengers sipped coffee as they scrolled through their phones, while flight announcements echoed overhead. Jade Montgomery stepped into the first-class lounge, her tailored navy suit perfectly pressed and her soft curls framing a face that exuded quiet confidence. The subtle scent of leather and coffee filled the room, mingling with the hushed tones of exclusivity that marked such spaces. At just 22, Jade had carved a path for herself that many would envy. Closing a major investment deal the day before had been the culmination of months of hard work, late nights, and relentless determination. Yet, as she crossed the room to settle into a seat near the large windows, she felt the weight of glances, not admiring, but appraising. She could almost hear the unspoken questions that seemed to follow her everywhere. How did she get here? Does she belong? Jade placed her leather carry-on neatly by her side and gazed out at the runway, where planes taxied beneath the soft morning light. She had learned to mask her discomfort over the years, but moments like these were always a quiet reminder of the battles she fought just by being seen in spaces like this. She allowed herself a brief, almost imperceptible sigh before, straightening her posture, her mother's voice echoed in her mind, as it often did in moments of doubt. "Jade, you're going to face barriers," Alexandra Montgomery had told her countless times, her tone as firm as it was loving. "Your strength lies in how you respond to them. Let no one make you feel small." Alexandra, a trailblazing CEO, in her own right, had broken barriers Jade couldn't even imagine, carving out a place for herself in the upper echelons of corporate America as a black woman. She had raised Jade with the same grit and grace that had propelled her to success, and Jade wore that legacy like armor. Still, it didn't make the stares or the whispered judgments any easier. "Can I help you?" The voice pulled her from her thoughts. Jade turned to see a flight attendant standing a few feet away. The woman's uniform was immaculate, her name, Tag reading Victoria Sinclair in neat black letters. She looked to be in her 50s, her sharp features framed by a tight, no-nonsense bun. Victoria's expression was polite but distant, her eyes scanning Jade in a way that felt more like assessment than assistance. "No, thank you," Jade replied, offering a polite smile. Victoria lingered for a moment, her gaze flicking from Jade's face to the neatly folded boarding pass on the table beside her. There was no mistaking the subtle tightening of her lips or the brief narrowing of her eyes. "Are you sure you're in the right section?" she asked, her tone teetering between professionalism and suspicion. Jade's smile faltered for a split second, but she recovered quickly. Without a word, she picked up her boarding pass and held it out, her hand steady. Victoria leaned in just enough to glance at it, her expression betraying no apology as she straightened. "Very well," Victoria said curtly before turning on her heel and walking away, her shoes clicking against the tiled floor with an almost deliberate rhythm. Jade placed the boarding pass back on the table and exhaled quietly, her fingers brushing against the cool leather of her bag. Moments like these always left a bitter taste, no matter how composed she appeared on the outside. She glanced around the room, catching the faintest hint of curiosity in the eyes of other passengers. Some quickly looked away when she met their gaze, while others continued their thinly veiled stares. At the counter, near the lounge entrance, Victoria leaned slightly against the polished surface, her eyes drifting back toward Jade. Something about the young woman unsettled her. Victoria prided herself on maintaining the standard of first-class passengers, and Jade, with her youthful confidence and calm demeanor, felt out of place. "Victoria, are you coming?" The question came from Rosa Mendez, a younger flight attendant with a warm, approachable smile. Rosa stood a few steps away, holding a clipboard, her expression neutral but her tone gently urging. Victoria straightened, smoothing the front of her uniform before casting one last glance at Jade. Without a word, she followed Rosa toward the crew briefing area. Jade adjusted the strap of her watch and leaned back in her chair, her gaze returning to the windows. Outside, a plane roared to life, its engines a low rumble against the glass. She told herself to shake off the encounter, to focus on the success of her recent deal and the promising future that awaited her. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that this was only the beginning. She had felt it before, this subtle tension, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. She didn't know why, but something about this flight felt different. Victoria's lingering glance as she exited the lounge left a faint unease in the air, and for the first time that morning, Jade wondered if the turbulence ahead would come long before they even reached the skies. The low hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin, a steady rhythm that seemed to lull most passengers into quiet comfort. Jade Montgomery adjusted her seat slightly, resting her hands on the smooth armrests as she gazed out the window. Clouds stretched endlessly below the plane, a soft white ocean against the crisp blue sky. The view should have been calming, but Jade couldn't shake a faint tension lingering in the air. Her instincts weren't wrong. Victoria Sinclair stood near the galley at the front of the cabin, her sharp gaze darting toward Jade every so often. Something about the young woman unsettled her, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Perhaps it was Jade's quiet confidence, or the way she seemed entirely at ease in a space Victoria had unconsciously deemed exclusive. Whatever it was, it gnawed at Victoria, a discomfort she masked with a practiced air of professionalism. Jade, for her part, had grown adept at sensing these undercurrents. She recognized the weight of stares that lingered a second too long and the clipped tones reserved for people like her in spaces like this. It was a familiar script, one she had encountered at corporate dinners, in boardrooms, and now 30,000 feet in the air. Her thoughts drifted to a particular memory. 2 years earlier, she had been a bright-eyed intern, invited to a high-profile company gala. The honor quickly turned sour when a senior executive had mistaken her for a member of the catering staff, asking her to fetch a drink. The sting of that moment had lingered far beyond the evening, a bitter reminder of the assumptions people often made about her. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, as they always did in moments like this. "Your strength lies in how you respond, Jade. Never let anyone steal your composure." Alexandra Montgomery had built her career on that very principle, rising to the top of corporate America through sheer determination and an unshakable sense of self. Jade carried that same resolve, though it didn't make moments like these any less exhausting. She turned her attention back to the cabin just as Rosa Mendez approached with the drinks cart. Rosa's warm smile softened the tension in the air, her friendly demeanor a stark contrast to Victoria's aloofness. "Would you like something to drink, Miss Montgomery?" Rosa asked, her voice kind and genuine. "Just water, thank you," Jade replied, her tone polite but distant. She appreciated Rosa's effort, but the unease in the cabin made it hard to fully relax. Rosa poured the water with practiced precision, her movements efficient yet thoughtful. Victoria hovered nearby, watching the interaction with a critical eye. As Rosa moved on to the next row, Victoria stepped in, her presence casting a shadow over the cabin. Thomas Bradford, seated across the aisle, signaled for her attention. He was a man of a certain age, his tailored suit and gold cufflinks broadcasting his wealth and status. He glanced briefly at Jade before turning to Victoria with a slight smirk. "Champagne, please," he said, his voice tinged with entitlement. Victoria poured his drink with a graciousness that seemed exaggerated, her demeanor almost deferential. As she continued down the aisle, her attentiveness faltered the moment she reached Jade's row. Without so much as a glance, Victoria skipped over Jade entirely, moving on to serve the couple seated behind her. Jade noticed immediately. Her eyes followed Victoria's deliberate movements, her grip tightening on the glass of water in her hand. The slight was subtle enough to be dismissed as an oversight, but its intentionality was unmistakable. Across the aisle, Thomas chuckled softly, the sound low and condescending. Jade caught his gaze briefly, her expression unflinching. She refused to give him the reaction he seemed to expect, though her frustration simmered beneath the surface. Rosa, returning from the back of the cabin, hesitated as she passed Jade's seat. Her face betrayed a flicker of unease, a silent acknowledgement of the slight she had witnessed. "Miss Montgomery, if there's anything else you need, please let me know," she said softly, her tone carrying an unspoken apology. "Thank you," Jade replied, her voice calm but firm. She appreciated Rosa's effort, but it wasn't enough to erase the tension that now hung heavy in the air. Other passengers had begun to take notice. A woman 2 rows back discreetly raised her phone, angling it to record what she sensed might escalate. An older man across the aisle frowned, his disapproval evident as he glanced between Victoria and Jade. Victoria, oblivious or indifferent to the growing scrutiny, continued her rounds with a calculated efficiency. To her, the slight was insignificant, a moment that would be forgotten before the plane touched down. But for Jade, it was another addition to the long list of unspoken battles she fought daily. As the minutes dragged on, the cabin grew quieter, the hum of the engines the only consistent sound. Jade sat still, her mind racing as she weighed her next move. She thought again of her mother, of the advice Alexandra had given her after the gala incident. "Choose your battles wisely, Jade," she had said. "Some fights are worth the risk." This felt like one of those fights. She took another sip of her water, her gaze steady as she watched Victoria retreat toward the front of the cabin. A storm brewed inside her, quiet but powerful. Though she didn't know how or when, she could feel that this flight was about to shift in ways no one expected. As the plane soared higher, the tension in the cabin mirrored the turbulence yet to come. Jade could sense it. A confrontation was inevitable, and this time she wouldn't stay silent. The steady hum of the airplane's engines filled the cabin as Jade Montgomery shifted in her seat, attempting to find a semblance of calm. Her hands rested lightly on the armrests, her grip relaxing and tightening as the tension in the air around her thickened. She gazed out the window, trying to focus on the endless expanse of clouds stretching across the horizon, but her mind refused to quiet. She could feel the scrutiny without even looking up. Victoria Sinclair lingered at the front of the cabin, clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. Her eyes flicked toward Jade, then quickly away, but the tension in her posture betrayed her disapproval. There was something about Jade's presence that gnawed at her, though she couldn't articulate exactly why. Jade didn't just occupy a seat in first class. She exuded a quiet confidence, a composed elegance that Victoria found unsettling. Jade had seen this before, the kind of deliberate scrutiny that sought to unsettle and diminish. She recognized the tight-lipped glances, the way questions were framed to suggest doubt rather than curiosity. It was a language she'd learned to interpret over the years, and it was exhausting. Her mother's words, ever a steady anchor in. Her mind surfaced once again, "Your strength lies in your composure. Never let them see you falter." But Jade's composure was being tested. Victoria approached with slow, measured steps, her expression carefully neutral, but her intent unmistakable. When she stopped at Jade's row, she held her clipboard like a shield, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Miss Montgomery, I need to verify your boarding pass again." Jade looked up, surprised. She placed her water glass on the tray table and tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor unwavering. "I already showed it when I boarded," she replied, her voice steady. "Yes," Victoria said, her tone polite but edged with something sharper, "but it's standard procedure to confirm passenger details periodically. I'm sure you understand." Passengers nearby stirred in their seats. Subtle glances were exchanged, and a few leaned in slightly, their curiosity piqued. Jade inhaled slowly, her fingers brushing against the soft leather of her bag as she retrieved her boarding pass. She handed it over without a word, her steady gaze never leaving Victoria's face. Victoria studied the pass for what felt like an unnecessarily long time, her eyes darting over the details as if searching for an inconsistency. When none appeared, she handed it back with a tight smile. "Thank you for your cooperation," she said, turning away without another word. Jade slipped the boarding pass back into her bag and leaned back in her seat, her hand resting lightly on the armrest. Her composure remained intact, but her chest tightened with the familiar weight of frustration. Victoria wasn't finished. Minutes later she returned, her clipboard still in hand and her demeanor more rigid than before. This time, her voice carried a tone of finality as she said, "Miss Montgomery, I'm afraid I'll need you to move to another seat." Jade blinked, her mind racing to catch up with the absurdity of the statement. "Excuse me?" she said, her tone sharper now. "This section is reserved for passengers with valid first-class tickets," Victoria continued, her words deliberate and loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some with raised eyebrows, others with faint frowns of disapproval. Jade sat up straighter, her calm exterior cracking just slightly as frustration bubbled to the surface. "I have a valid first-class ticket," she said, her voice firm. Victoria's posture stiffened. "If that's the case, I'll need to confirm it with the flight manifest. Until then, I must insist you cooperate by moving to economy." A woman seated 2 rows back, discreetly raised, her phone angling it to capture the scene. Another passenger, an older man with a silver beard, cleared his throat loudly, his disapproval clear as he muttered something under his breath. Jade remained still, her eyes locked on Victoria's. "I'm not moving," she said, each word deliberate. "You've already verified my ticket. I belong here." The weight of her words seemed to hang in the air, silencing the whispers momentarily. Rosa Mendez, who had been standing near the drinks cart, froze. Her expression was a mix of discomfort and quiet frustration. But she didn't step forward. Victoria's face flushed slightly, but she didn't back down. Instead, she clutched her clipboard tighter and said, "I'll have to speak to the captain if you refuse to cooperate." Jade leaned back, crossing her legs with a deliberate grace that belied the storm brewing inside her. "Please do," she replied coldly. Victoria hesitated for a brief moment before turning sharply on her heel and heading toward the cockpit. Her movements were quick, almost mechanical, as if distancing herself from the mounting tension. As the flight attendant disappeared from view, the murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Jade's gaze remained steady, her body still, but her mind raced with emotions she worked hard to contain. "Unbelievable," the silver-haired man muttered again, his voice louder this time. Rosa hesitated, then approached Jade. Her voice was soft, but filled with unspoken apology. "Miss Montgomery, if there's anything else you need, please don't hesitate to ask." Jade turned to her, her tone calm but resolute. "Thank you," she said, her words carrying more weight than the simple phrase suggested. She returned her attention to the window, her reflection staring back at her from the glass. Outside, the clouds rolled on, serene and unbothered, in stark contrast to the turbulence growing inside her. The cabin buzzed with low whispers as Jade sat motionless, her composure a fragile mask over the storm within. She could feel it. The confrontation was far from over, and this time she wouldn't let it pass unchallenged. The steady hum of the engines was a constant backdrop, but it did little to ease the tension that hung thick in the air. Jade Montgomery sat motionless, her gaze fixed out the window as she tried to steady her breathing. Outside, the clouds rolled by, serene and unbothered, a stark contrast to the storm brewing within the cabin. Victoria Sinclair moved with deliberate purpose, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the passengers as though rehearsing her next move. When her gaze landed on Jade, it lingered for a moment too long, carrying a weight of judgment that was impossible to ignore. Jade noticed, but didn't react. She had spent her life perfecting the art of maintaining composure in the face of scrutiny, a skill honed from years of navigating spaces that questioned her right to belong. But the tight grip on the armrest of her seat betrayed the calm exterior she worked so hard to project. Victoria approached her seat, stopping with the practiced air of authority. "Miss Montgomery," she began, her tone clipped and professional, "I need to verify your boarding pass again." Jade blinked, surprised by the audacity of the request. She had already presented her boarding pass earlier, and the implications of being singled out were clear. Slowly, she placed her water glass on the tray table and met Victoria's gaze with a measured calm. "I've already shown it to you," she said evenly. Victoria's lips tightened into a thin line. "Yes, but it seems there's been an issue. With the manifest, I'm sure you understand the need to confirm passenger details." The murmurs from nearby passengers grew louder, their curiosity piqued by the interaction. Some leaned in slightly while others exchanged knowing looks, their expressions reflecting a mix of discomfort and disbelief. Jade sighed softly, retrieving her boarding pass with deliberate care. She handed it over without a word, her gaze unwavering. Victoria accepted it, her eyes scanning the document with an exaggerated focus that bordered on theatrical. When no discrepancies could be found, she returned it with a curt nod. "Thank you for your cooperation," Victoria said, her tone lacking any trace of genuine gratitude. Jade returned the boarding pass to her bag, her hand steady even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. She wanted to move on, to let the moment pass, but Victoria's presence remained, looming over her like a storm cloud refusing to dissipate. Moments later, Victoria returned, her movements sharper, her voice colder. "Miss Montgomery, I'm afraid I'll have to ask you to move to a different seat. This section is reserved for passengers with valid first-class tickets." Jade froze, her heart pounding. The audacity of the statement hit her like a physical blow. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself before responding. "I have a valid first-class ticket," she said firmly. Victoria's posture stiffened. "If that's the case, I'll need to confirm it with the captain. Until then, I'll ask for your cooperation in moving to an economy seat." The whispers in the cabin grew louder, and Jade could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her. Across the aisle, an older man shook his head, muttering under his breath, while a woman 2 rows back discreetly raised her phone to record the scene. Jade met Victoria's gaze, her voice sharp and unyielding. "I'm not moving. You've already verified my ticket, and it clearly states that I belong here." The firmness in her tone caused a flicker of uncertainty to cross Victoria's face. For a moment, the older woman seemed unsure of her next move, but the tension in her posture betrayed her determination to push forward. "If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to involve the captain," Victoria said, her voice louder now, as if seeking validation from the surrounding passengers. "Please do," Jade replied coldly. "I'll be right here." Victoria turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the cockpit, her footsteps sharp and deliberate. The murmurs in the cabin swelled, the atmosphere thick with a mixture of outrage and unease. Unable to sit still, Jade unbuckled her seatbelt and rose from her seat. She ignored the curious glances and made her way toward the bathroom, needing a moment to collect herself away from the suffocating tension of the cabin. Inside the cramped bathroom, Jade leaned against the door, her chest heaving as she let the weight of the moment settle over her. Her reflection in the small mirror stared back at her, the cracks in her composure now visible. For the first time, her calm facade slipped, and she allowed herself to feel the frustration, the anger, the exhaustion of a lifetime of moments like this. She splashed cold water on her face, the chill grounding her as she closed her eyes and inhaled deeply. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, a steady anchor amidst the chaos. "Never let them see you falter, Jade. Your strength lies in your composure." Straightening her posture, she reached for her phone, her fingers trembling, slightly as she dialed the number she knew by heart. "Mom," she said quietly when the call connected. "Jade, what's wrong?" Alexandra Montgomery's voice was calm, but immediately alert, carrying a weight of authority that Jade had always found reassuring. Jade recounted the situation, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotions roiling within her. On the other end of the line, Alex listened in silence, her measured breathing the only sound. "I see," Alex said finally, her tone cool and deliberate. "Stay calm, Jade. I'll handle this." Jade let out a slow breath, the tension in her chest easing slightly. "Thanks, Mom," she said softly. "You're stronger than this," Alex said. "Don't let them rattle you. I'll make some calls immediately. This will be resolved." When the call ended, Jade felt a renewed sense of resolve settle over her. She stared at her reflection once more, the vulnerability replaced by quiet determination. She returned to her seat with her shoulders squared, her chin held high. The murmurs in the cabin quieted as she passed, but the weight of the passengers' gazes remained. Victoria, now back at the front of the cabin, glanced at Jade briefly, her expression flickering with unease. Jade didn't look away. Her calm exterior had returned, but beneath it lay a storm waiting to be unleashed. As Victoria shifted uncomfortably at the front of the cabin, Jade felt the power dynamic begin to change. Something was coming, and for the first time, it wouldn't be. Jade left questioning her place. The hum of the engines had become a background murmur, overwhelmed by the rising tension in the first-class cabin. Jade Montgomery sat upright in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap as her mind raced. Around her, the murmur of passengers was a low static, an unspoken current of unease that swirled through the air. Victoria Sinclair stood at the front of the aisle, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest. Her face, usually composed, was flushed, and her eyes darted nervously between the cockpit door and the passengers. The weight of their judgment was palpable. Phones were out, cameras discreetly angled to capture the unfolding drama. Whispers grew louder, no longer fully hidden, as the scene took on a life of its own. The intercom crackled, and Captain Marcus Chen's voice broke through the tension. His tone was steady, but the gravity of his words was undeniable. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to unforeseen circumstances, we will be making an unscheduled landing at the nearest airport. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. Thank you for your patience." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the cabin like a wave. Jade's stomach twisted. An emergency landing? Her mind raced to process the implications, but her expression remained stoic. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, their curiosity and judgment pressing down like a physical force. Victoria turned sharply and disappeared into the cockpit, leaving a trail of unease in her wake. Her movements were brisk and mechanical, A stark contrast to her earlier confidence. Rosa Mendez appeared at Jade's side, her kind eyes filled with a mix of apology and quiet determination. "Miss Montgomery," she said softly, leaning in just enough to be heard over the murmurs, "I'm so sorry about everything that's happened. I promise you, not all of us feel this way." Jade turned her head to Rosa, her expression softening slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm but steady. The words carried more weight than they seemed, a quiet acknowledgement of Rosa's courage in a moment where others chose silence. Nearby, passengers began speaking more openly. "This is ridiculous," an older woman muttered, shaking her head in disapproval. "Typical power trip," a younger man said under his breath, his phone still trained discreetly on the aisle. Jade caught snippets of the conversations there, words a blend of indignation and quiet support. For the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. The engines shifted to a lower hum, signaling the descent. Outside the window, the clouds gave way to a patchwork of city streets and fields, the ground creeping closer with each passing second. When the plane finally touched down, the familiar jolt of the landing gear meeting pavement reverberated through the cabin. The engines roared briefly before settling into an idle hum, and the passengers braced themselves for what came next. Jade's heart pounded as she spotted movement outside the window. A group of uniformed personnel waited near the terminal, airline, representatives, security officials, and, to her surprise, members of the press. Their presence added an undeniable weight to the situation, a reminder that this was no longer just about her. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A message from her mother lit up the screen. "I'm here. Stay strong." A flicker of relief broke through the tension in Jade's chest. If her mother was here, she knew things were about to change. The cabin door opened, and the harsh light of the runway spilled into the space. Passengers began to rise, their movements slow and uncertain, as if waiting for an unspoken cue. Thomas Bradford stood, his posture straight and self-assured as he made his way down the aisle. Victoria followed close behind, her clipboard clutched like a lifeline. Jade's eyes followed them, her jaw tightening as she braced herself for what was to come. Rosa lingered by Jade's row, her presence a small but steady source of reassurance. "Whatever happens next," she said quietly, "just know you're not alone in this." Jade nodded, her grip on her phone tightening as she rose to her feet. The murmurs in the cabin had quieted, replaced by a tense silence. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her as she moved toward the exit, her movements deliberate and composed. Stepping into the light of the runway, Jade was met with a wall of scrutiny. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured among themselves, and the gathered personnel stood poised, their expressions unreadable. At the edge of the commotion stood Alexandra Montgomery. Her presence was commanding, her tailored suit immaculate, and her expression a mix of calm authority and quiet determination. The air seemed to shift as their eyes met, a silent exchange of strength passing between mother and daughter. Jade's steps quickened as she descended the stairs, the tension in her chest easing slightly with each step. Alexandra moved forward, her presence cutting through the chaos like a beacon. The game had changed. As Alexandra placed a reassuring hand on Jade's shoulder, her gaze swept over the scene with quiet intensity. Justice was no longer a distant hope. It was here, and everyone was about to witness it. The runway was bathed in the harsh glow of floodlights, casting long shadows that stretched toward the waiting crowd. Jade Montgomery stepped off the plane, her steps measured and deliberate, her head held high despite the turmoil roiling inside. The murmurs of passengers behind her, the buzz of press cameras, and the distant hum of airport activity all blurred into background noise. At the foot of the stairs, Alexandra Montgomery stood with her corporate team, her presence commanding and unshakable. Clad in a tailored suit that spoke of authority and purpose, Alex exuded a quiet power that silenced even the most cynical observer. Her gaze locked on Jade, and for a moment, the chaos around them seemed to fade. Jade approached her mother, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly as she drew strength from Alex's calm resolve. Without a word, Alex placed a reassuring hand on Jade's arm, a simple gesture that carried the weight of unwavering support. Victoria Sinclair followed closely behind. Her clipboard now clutched more like a shield than a tool. Her earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a palpable unease. She had begun to piece together the truth, but the full gravity of her actions hadn't yet settled in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alex began, her voice clear and firm, cutting through the chatter like a blade. The gathered press turned their cameras toward her, their lenses capturing the moment as it unfolded. "I am Alexandra Montgomery, CEO of this airline. I have been informed of a deeply troubling incident that occurred during this flight. Let me be clear, discrimination of any kind will not be tolerated in my company." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, the weight of Alex's words landing with force. Passengers began stepping forward, emboldened by Alex's presence. An older woman, her face stern, raised her voice. "I saw everything. That flight." Attendant was out of line. She singled out this young woman for no reason. A younger man with a smartphone held aloft added, "I've got it all on video. She didn't deserve any of this." Victoria's face paled as the testimonies mounted, her grip on the clipboard tightening as though it might anchor her against the rising tide. Thomas Bradford, watching the scene unfold, attempted to step away, but Alex's sharp gaze caught him. "And you," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a whip. "As a senior representative of this airline, you had a responsibility to ensure the dignity and fairness of all passengers. Instead, you stood by and allowed this to happen," Thomas stammered, his usual smugness faltering. I had no idea it had gone this far. This is enough," Alex interrupted, her voice calm but unyielding. "Your complicity speaks volumes. There will be consequences." Jade stood silently beside her mother, her composure unbroken. She didn't need to say anything. The voices of the passengers and Alex's firm stance spoke louder than words ever could. Rosa Mendez, the younger flight attendant, stepped forward hesitantly. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was steady. "I saw what happened," she said, her gaze flickering to Jade. "Victoria's behavior was unacceptable. She treated Miss Montgomery unfairly from the moment she boarded the plane." Victoria's mask of professionalism cracked further. "I was just following protocol," she muttered, her voice defensive. Alex turned to her, her expression cold. "Protocol does not justify discrimination. Your actions reflect not only on yourself, but on this company as a whole, and I will not stand for it." The silence that followed was heavy, the weight of accountability pressing down on everyone. Unpresent, as Alex prepared to address the gathered press, she turned to the crowd, her voice carrying a new urgency. "Today is about more than one incident. It's about the change we must demand, together. Stories like this remind us why we must stand up, speak out, and act against injustice wherever we see it." She paused, her eyes scanning the faces before her, including the passengers, reporters, and onlookers. Then she added with a warm but firm tone, "If this story has resonated with you, if you believe in standing for justice and equality, don't just watch. Be part of the change. Subscribe to our channel to stay informed, to share these stories, and to amplify the voices that need to be heard. Together, we can make a difference." Jade glanced at her mother, a flicker of pride crossing her face. Alex's words were more than a call to action. They were a promise. The press cameras clicked furiously, capturing the moment as it unfolded. Victoria stood frozen, her defiance finally giving way to the weight of her guilt. As Alex turned back to Jade, her expression softened, the fierce CEO giving way to the protective mother. "This isn't over," she said quietly, her words carrying a resolute strength, "but we're going to make it right." Jade nodded, her quiet strength shining through. Together, they turned to face the gathered crowd, the promise of justice etched in every step they took forward. The airport's VIP lounge was unusually quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights and distant murmurs, the only sounds breaking the stillness. Alexandra Montgomery stood at the center of the room, her posture straight and commanding, her sharp gaze moving between the faces of the gathered crowd. Her tailored suit, immaculate as ever, was a testament to the meticulous control she wielded in every aspect of her life, control that was now directed at bringing justice for her daughter. Victoria Sinclair sat in a chair near the corner of the room, her once confident demeanor now replaced by visible discomfort. Her clipboard lay abandoned on the table before her, its edges crumpled where her fingers had gripped it too tightly. Thomas Bradford hovered nearby, his usual air of authority diminished, his movements hesitant as though searching for an escape. Jade Montgomery sat beside her mother, her back straight, her face calm but resolute, though her composure remained. Unbroken, the strain of the past few hours showed in the tightness around her eyes. Alexandra placed a hand on Jade's shoulder, a silent reassurance that she was no longer fighting this battle alone. The gathered passengers stood near the back of the room, many of them eager to speak, their indignation still simmering. Rosa Mendez lingered close to the edge of the group, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She caught Jade's eye briefly and gave a small, encouraging nod. Alexandra broke the silence, her voice sharp and steady. "Before we begin, I want to thank each of you who stepped forward. Your courage to speak out matters. Injustice thrives in silence, and today you have refused to let it." Her words hung in the air, drawing murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Several passengers nodded, their resolve visibly bolstered. Turning her attention to Victoria and Thomas, Alexandra's tone hardened. "Now, let's address the matter at hand. Miss Sinclair, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Victoria flinched slightly, her eyes darting to Thomas as though searching for support. When none came, she straightened her posture, attempting to muster a shred of her former confidence. "I was following protocol," she said, her voice defensive. "I didn't mean to offend anyone." "Enough," Alexandra interrupted, her tone cutting through the weak justification. "Your actions were not about protocol, they were about bias, your bias, and your behavior reflects not only on yourself, but on this entire company." Victoria's face flushed, her hands twisting in her lap. "I didn't realize—" "That is exactly the problem," Alexandra snapped, her voice rising slightly. "You didn't realize. You didn't think. You acted out of prejudice, and now you must face the consequences." The crowd murmured again, louder this time. A woman from the group stepped forward, her expression firm. "We all saw what happened," she said. "This wasn't a misunderstanding. She treated Jade differently from the moment she boarded the plane," another passenger chimed in. "And when people started recording, she doubled down instead of backing off. It was appalling." Rosa stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice steady. Victoria ignored Jade during service, questioned her ticket without cause, and publicly humiliated her. "That's not protocol, that's discrimination." Victoria sank further into her chair, her confidence crumbling under the weight of the testimonies. Alexandra turned her gaze to Thomas, her eyes narrowing. "And you, Mr. Bradford, as a senior representative of this airline, you had every opportunity to step in and do the right thing. Instead, you chose to remain silent. Why?" Thomas stammered, his usual smooth demeanor faltering. I didn't realize the situation had escalated to this point. I was focused on protecting yourself," Alexandra finished for him, her voice cold. Well, that ends now. Both of you will be held accountable for your actions, or lack thereof. Her words carried a finality that silenced the room. Turning to Jade, Alexandra's voice softened. Jade, you have shown incredible strength through all of this. Your composure in the face of such blatant discrimination is a testament to your character. But you shouldn't have had to endure this in the first place. Jade met her mother's gaze, her calm facade wavering slightly as emotion threatened to break through. She took a deep breath and nodded, her gratitude unspoken but understood. Alexandra addressed the gathered passengers once more. This incident highlights the work we still have to do. Discrimination in any form is unacceptable, and it will not be tolerated under my leadership. Effective immediately, I will implement mandatory diversity training for all employees of this airline. Additionally, new oversight measures will be established to ensure incidents like this never happen again. The crowd murmured their approval, several passengers breaking into quiet applause. Turning to the press cameras that had been discreetly capturing the scene, Alexandra's voice carried a new urgency. This is about more than one incident. It's about standing together, demanding better, and refusing to stay silent. If you believe in justice, in equality, in the power of collective action, join us. Share this story. Amplify these voices. And if you want to stay part of this journey, subscribe to our channel. Together, we can build a future where stories like this are the exception, not the norm. Her words were met with nods of agreement and flashes from cameras. Victoria, now visibly shaken, attempted to stand. "I'm sorry," she muttered, her voice barely audible. "Your apology will mean more when it's backed by action," Alexandra replied firmly. As the crowd began to disperse, Alexandra turned to Jade, her expression softening. "This is just the beginning," she said quietly. "We've made our stand, but the work isn't done, and I'll be with you every step of the way." Jade nodded, a small but determined smile breaking through. Together they walked toward the waiting press, the promise of justice lighting their path forward. A week had passed since the incident, but its impact rippled far beyond the confines of the first-class cabin. What had begun as a moment of injustice, captured on passengers' phones, had ignited a global conversation. Social media platforms, buzzed with hashtags like Justice for Jade and Equality in the Airline, each post a testament to the power of shared voices demanding accountability. Jade Montgomery sat at her kitchen table, the morning light streaming in through the windows, bathing the room in a soft glow. The sunlight felt ironic against the storm of emotions churning within her. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the table, the screen lighting up with notifications. Some messages were heartfelt and supportive, from strangers who saw her as a symbol of resilience. Others, filled with vitriol, reminded her of the steep hill society still had to climb. She sipped her coffee, her thoughts flickering between gratitude and exhaustion. The weight of the attention pressed on her like a tangible force, but she refused to let it crush her. Across the table, her mother, Alexandra Montgomery, watched her with quiet understanding. "You've done remarkably well under the circumstances," Alexandra said, her voice steady and reassuring. Jade looked up, meeting her mother's gaze. "It doesn't feel like it," she admitted, her tone laced with vulnerability. "It feels overwhelming, like I'm supposed to have all the answers now, but I didn't ask for this." Alexandra's expression softened as she reached across the table, placing a hand over Jade's. "You didn't ask for it, but you're here now. And what you're doing matters. People are listening because you showed strength in a moment where many would have crumbled. That's not something to take lightly." Jade nodded, the tightness in her chest easing slightly. "It's just hard to know where to start. You start by being true to yourself," Alexandra said, "and by remembering that you don't have to do this alone. The media frenzy surrounding the incident had been relentless. Major news outlets dissected every detail, from the initial confrontation to Alexandra's decisive actions at the airport. Passenger testimonies filled the airwaves, each story adding to the mosaic of injustice and resilience. Jade scrolled through her phone, pausing at a video of a passenger recounting the moment Victoria Sinclair demanded her ticket. The woman's voice trembled with outrage, her words echoing the sentiments of millions. Why should she have to prove she belongs? She belongs because she's here, just like the rest of us. Jade's heart tightened as she read the comments beneath the video. Most were supportive, but some were sharp and dismissive. The dichotomy was a reminder of how far society had come and how far it still had to go. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a reminder about her upcoming interview. It would be her first time addressing the public directly since the incident. A knot formed in her stomach at the thought of stepping into the spotlight, but she knew it was a step she had to take. That afternoon, Jade found herself seated in a bright studio, the hum of cameras and soft chatter of the crew filling the space. The journalist sitting across from her greeted her warmly, but there was no mistaking the intensity of the moment. As the interview began, Jade recounted the events of the flight with calm precision. She described the humiliation, the strength she drew from her mother, and the passengers who stood by her. The journalist leaned forward slightly, her tone shifting. "Jade, this story has struck a chord with millions. You've become a symbol of resilience and justice. What do you want people to take away from this?" Jade paused, her thoughts settling as she considered her words. "This isn't just about me," she began, her voice steady but heartfelt. "It's about the countless moments like this that go unseen and unspoken. It's about the people who endure them every day, often without anyone to stand with them. I was lucky. I had my mom. I had people who believed in me. But so many don't, and that's why it's important to speak up, to support each other, and to demand better." She turned to the camera, her gaze unwavering. "If you've ever felt like you didn't belong, know that you do. And if you've ever seen someone being treated unfairly, don't stay silent. Be the voice they need. Together we can create a world where no one has to question their worth." The journalist nodded, visibly moved. "Your mother has been a central figure in this story as well. What role has she played in all of this?" Jade smiled softly. "She's always been my anchor. Watching her lead with strength and compassion has taught me so much. This isn't just about fixing what went wrong. It's about building something better. And she's the reason I believe that's possible." That evening, the interview aired, sparking an immediate wave of responses. Viewers flooded social media with messages of solidarity, many sharing their own stories of discrimination and perseverance. The hashtags #Justice for Jade and #Equality in the airline grew even larger, spreading the conversation far beyond the airline industry. Meanwhile, Alexandra's reforms began to ripple through the corporate world. Competitor airlines announced similar initiatives, eager to avoid the scrutiny that had engulfed the Montgomery Company. News outlets reported on passengers from other flights coming forward with their experiences, inspired by Jade's courage to speak out. As Jade sat in her living room that night, scrolling through the flood of reactions, her phone buzzed with a message. Rosa Mendez's name appeared on the screen, accompanied by a short but heartfelt note. "Thank you for being brave, Jade. Because of you, I found my voice too." A small smile broke across Jade's face as she set the phone down. For the first time in days, the weight on her chest felt lighter. As Jade looked out at the city lights, the world beyond her window seemed full of possibility. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time she felt like they were moving forward together. The city stretched out before Victoria Sinclair as she sat at a small desk in her modest apartment. The soft hum of traffic below was a constant reminder of the life that moved on around her, even as she remained stuck in a liminal space of self-reflection and regret. The notebook before her lay open, its pages blank, mirroring the uncertainty that clouded her mind. The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of consequence and revelation. Her termination had been swift and public, and the fallout was equally unrelenting. Strangers hurled accusations, friends distanced themselves, and the woman who had once commanded respect now found herself grappling with the weight of her actions. The diversity training sessions she had attended were no longer a formality. They were a mirror, reflecting the biases she had long ignored. She glanced at her phone, the screen lighting up with a reminder of today's training. This session was different. The facilitator was Rosa Mendez. Victoria swallowed hard, knowing this confrontation was inevitable. The training room buzzed faintly with quiet conversations and the shuffle of papers. Rows of participants sat scattered throughout, their expressions varying from curiosity to indifference. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee, a testament to the room's utilitarian purpose. Victoria entered cautiously, choosing a seat near the back. At the front of the room, Rosa stood with calm authority, her presence both professional and approachable. Her eyes scanned the crowd, pausing briefly when they landed on Victoria. Rosa's expression remained neutral, though there was an unmistakable flicker of recognition. "Good afternoon, everyone," Rosa began, her voice clear and steady. "Today's session is about unconscious bias, understanding how it shapes our actions and finding ways to overcome it." As Rosa spoke, Victoria felt a pang of guilt. Her actions on that flight had been anything but unconscious. They were deliberate, rooted in a sense of superiority she could no longer deny. The session unfolded with personal stories from participants. A middle-aged woman shared how she had unintentionally excluded colleagues from projects. An older man spoke of a time he had made assumptions about a co-worker's capabilities. Each story added to the mosaic of shared flaws and growth. Toward the end of the session, Rosa opened the floor to questions and reflections. Victoria hesitated, her heart pounding as she raised her hand. "When I started attending these sessions," she began, her voice faltering slightly, "I told myself I didn't belong here. I thought I was above this, but I've realized I was wrong. I caused harm because I was unwilling to see past my own biases. I know an apology can't undo the damage, but I'm committed to doing better." The room fell silent. Rosa met Victoria's gaze, her expression softening slightly. "Acknowledgement is a step," Rosa said, "but what matters most is what you choose to do next." That evening, Victoria returned to her apartment, the weight of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. Sitting at her desk, she opened her notebook and began to write. "Dear Jade and Alexandra, I want to express my deepest regret for my actions on that flight. What I did was inexcusable, and I am truly sorry for the pain I caused. These past months have been a journey of unlearning and reflection, and I am beginning to understand the depth of my own privilege and the harm it allowed me to perpetuate. I am not the same person I was then, and I am committed to continuing this work, not just for myself, but for the people around me. Thank you for holding me accountable. Your courage has been a catalyst for change, and I hope that someday I can be part of the solution instead of the problem." With humility and sincerity, Victoria Sinclair, she sealed the letter carefully, as if handling something fragile. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of hope, small but present. Days later, Jade sat in her apartment, the letter from Victoria resting on the coffee table. Alexandra sat across from her, the soft glow of the afternoon sun casting warm light over the room. "Have you read it?" Alexandra asked, her tone gentle. "Not yet," Jade replied, her eyes fixed on the envelope. "I'm not sure I'm ready." Alexandra leaned forward, placing a reassuring hand on Jade's arm. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of what they did. Whatever you decide, it's your choice and no one else's. Jade nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the envelope. The conflict within her was palpable, anger and pain mingling with the faintest stirrings of compassion. "I need time," she said finally. "Take all the time you need," Alexandra replied, her voice steady. Jade picked up the envelope, studying it as if it held the answer to a question she hadn't yet asked. She placed it in a drawer, the decision left unspoken for now. As Jade closed the drawer, she looked out at the city skyline. The world was still moving forward, and so was she. In her heart, she knew that forgiveness wasn't about the other person. It was about finding peace within herself. The sun rose over New York City, casting golden light across the skyline and signaling a day of transformation and reflection. For Jade Montgomery, it marked a milestone she hadn't anticipated, but now embraced. A year since the flight that changed her life and sparked a movement for justice. She stood at the entrance of the conference hall, her tailored navy suit impeccably pressed, her natural hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. Inside, the hall buzzed with the energy of hundreds of attendees, industry leaders, activists, media figures, and employees from her mother's airline. The event, Higher Ground, Redefining Equality in the Skies, was a celebration of progress and a call to continue the work of dismantling systemic discrimination. Jade took a deep breath, steadying herself. This moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had stood by her, spoken out, and demanded better. The room quieted as Alexandra Montgomery stepped onto the stage, her presence commanding as always. Her words were deliberate, her voice carrying the weight of both authority and compassion. "1 year ago," Alexandra began, "our airline faced a moment of reckoning. What began as an incident of discrimination exposed deeper issues not just within our company, but across the industry and beyond. Today, we gather to celebrate the progress we've made, but more importantly, to reaffirm our commitment to equality, accountability, and lasting change." She paused, letting her words settle over the audience. "This journey has been far from easy," she continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. "But progress rarely is. It requires courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. And it requires voices like the one I am honored to introduce now, someone who has turned pain into purpose, a moment into a movement. Ladies and gentlemen, my daughter, Jade Montgomery." The audience erupted into applause as Jade made her way to the stage, her heart pounding. She took her place at the podium, the bright stage lights momentarily blinding her. Then she found her mother's reassuring smile in the crowd, and her confidence steadied. "Thank you, Mom," Jade began, her voice steady and clear. "And thank you to everyone here today. A year ago, I boarded a flight expecting nothing more than a quiet journey home. Instead, I found myself in a situation that forced me to confront an all-too-common reality. The feeling of being unseen, unheard, and undervalued." Her voice softened as she continued, drawing the audience in. "What happened on that flight was painful, humiliating, and deeply personal. But it also became something bigger than me. It became a catalyst for change, thanks to the courage of passengers who spoke up, the support of strangers who believed in justice, and the leadership of a mother who has always taught me to stand tall, even when the world tries to knock you down." The room was silent, the audience hanging on her every word. This past year has been a journey, not just for me, but for all of us. We've seen what's possible when people come together, when voices unite to demand better, and we've learned that change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, a series of choices to listen, to learn, and to act. Jade's gaze swept across the audience, her voice growing firmer. To those who have experienced discrimination, know this. You are not alone. Your voice matters, and your story has the power to inspire change. And to those in positions of power, I urge you to use it wisely. Create spaces where everyone feels valued, where equality isn't just an aspiration, but a reality. The applause that followed was thunderous, reverberating through the hall like a wave of collective resolve. Later, as the event continued, Jade wandered through the hall, engaging with attendees who shared their own stories. Rosa Mendez approached her, her warm smile lighting up the space. "You were incredible up there," Rosa said, her voice filled with admiration. "Thank you," Jade replied sincerely. "And thank you for everything you've done this past year. Your courage that day made all the difference." Rosa's expression grew thoughtful. "I think we all learned something that day, and I'm just glad to see how far we've come." Their conversation was interrupted by an older woman who approached with tears in her eyes. "Miss Montgomery," she said, her voice trembling, "thank you. What you've done has given people like me hope. My daughter saw your story and decided to speak up at her job. You've changed more lives than you'll ever know." Jade's throat tightened as she listened. She reached out to clasp the woman's hands, her own eyes glistening. "Thank you for sharing that. It means more than I can say." As the evening wound down, Jade stepped outside onto a balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. The city lights sparkled below, a tapestry of endless possibilities. Alexandra joined her, her presence steady and grounding. "Lost in thought?" she asked, her tone warm. Jade smiled softly. "Just thinking about how far we've come and how far we still have to go." Alexandra placed an arm around her shoulders. "It's overwhelming at times, but it's worth it. Change doesn't happen in a single moment. It's a series of moments like this one that move us closer to where we need to be." Jade nodded, the weight on her chest easing. "We're stronger together," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Always," Alexandra replied. A few weeks later, Jade boarded another flight. As she settled into her seat, a flight attendant approached her with a warm smile. "Miss Montgomery, it's an honor to have you on board," the attendant said, her voice filled with genuine respect. Jade smiled back. "Thank you. It's good to be here." As the plane ascended, she glanced out the window, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt certain they were on the right path. As Jade stepped away from the balcony, the city lights shimmering below reminded her of the endless possibilities ahead. With her mother's unwavering support and her own quiet determination, she had turned a painful moment into a powerful movement. Jade Montgomery's journey didn't end there. It was only the beginning of a story that would inspire countless others to stand tall in the face of injustice. Her story is a testament to the strength found in unity and the courage it takes to spark change. If you were in Jade's shoes, how would you respond when confronted with discrimination? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and share this story to spread the message of justice and resilience. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us of the power of hope and collective action. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you